My name is Joshua Waits. I am the archivist here at Virginia Theological Seminary. Today is May 22nd, 2023 at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon. I'm here with Beth O'Callaghan. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Joshua. I'm glad to be here.
So let's just start with some basic biographical information. Would you please start by telling us your full name, please?
Elizabeth Putnam O'Callaghan.
And how would you prefer to be addressed? Reverend, Dr.
Beth is fine.
Beth? Would you mind telling us your pronouns and how you identify?
She and her, and I identify as married lesbian.
When and where were you born?
Was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on April 25th, 1958.
All right.
Did you ask me my birth date? I don't know if you did or not.
I did. I said when and
Okay.
where. Would you mind telling us some of your background information, as in what was it like being a child growing up and what eventually led to you your own coming out experience?
Sure. I grew up in a solid family unit, although it was a blended family, so it was unusual at the time. My father had died when I was young, about 4 years old, and my mother remarried a man whose wife had died, and he had had 2 daughters. And when they married, there was 2 older sisters for me and a younger brother and me for my 2 older sisters. So we became a blended family. Grew up in Pennsylvania, in central Pennsylvania. Lived in the same house pretty much from age 6 on to going off to college. Attended high school and middle school and elementary school in that area. Very middle class, white community, not a lot of diversity, until I went off to college as a music major for a nanosecond. Eventually transferred to University of Maryland, where it was much more diverse, and found myself, having grown up in the Lutheran church as a very active person, eventually moving to Texas and for a master's degree, married a man who was formerly Roman Catholic, and we found the Episcopal Church together. We were married about 10 years before I realized I was in the wrong relationship for my sexual orientation. I was a late bloomer, as they say, and didn't come out until I was nearly 40, which was a real struggle. We were both very active in our Episcopal church, and our priest was not very affirming of me. So I moved to a different Episcopal church in Houston, where I could sit in the pew for 2 years and heal from feeling like I was losing a lot of things in my life. So coming out to my family at that late stage in my life was challenging, but not difficult. My parents were very accepting, my sisters, very accepting. And fortunately, sadly, my brother had already passed away. Yeah, I was in a very good place when that happened, although a lot of friends were not as supportive of me. But like I said, my family and my friends, or my parents, were great.
As part of your coming out process, did you become just aware that, okay, this is not working, I'm a lesbian, or did you go through like this, oh, I'm probably bisexual, or was there a shift to where you fully accepted yourself, or was it like obvious once you came to terms with yourself?
I would say that it was a journey of acceptance. I think deep down I knew, but I had no frame of reference. Really, growing up in the 60s and 70s, there wasn't nearly the role models or the conversation. Certainly in my Lutheran church, there wasn't anybody that I gravitated towards or could talk to, and so I think I buried what I knew deep down, until actually thought I was doing the right thing by getting married and moving into this relationship. Which my husband and I truly loved each other, but it was in a different way. Um, and so the journey to coming out was helped by a therapist, because I immediately started going to therapy when I was figuring this out, and doing a lot of reading and a lot of just discerning on my own. So I don't know that I went through sort of um, a journey through bisexuality, although I think that was something to consider. In fact, some people said, well, you could stay married and still, be who you are. And it just didn't seem fair to either myself or my spouse at the time. So we decided that that was not what we were going to do. Um, so yeah, it was a journey that took some time, about 2 years. But eventually, I knew I was who I was born to be, in my own skin and in my own life.
Mm.
And I had to tell my own priest, I know that God made me this way, and I know that I'm a beloved child of God, which I found sad at the time that that wasn't my priest saying that to me, but
Mm.
was me being able to just affirm myself.
Mm. Um, just for sort of background knowledge, which Lutheran denomination did you grow up in?
ELCA.
ELCA. Well, did you grow up in a conservative, progressive, moderate home?
Well, it's probably more conservative. Certainly politically conservative. My father was a political appointee in the state of Pennsylvania under the Republican administration, which was in the 70s a lot different than it is now today, as far as, saying you're a Republican. Um, but I found out in my conversations with my parents later in life that they knew people who that they knew people who were gay. They knew people who were staying in marriages because that's what was the thing to do of their generation, even though they were gay. Um, so in some ways they were progressive, but I just didn't know about it. I
Mhm.
mean, at least in their thoughts, but they were certainly more conservative. Um, but
How did they respond to your coming out?
I came out to my mother first, and she questioned. The first question she asked was, "Did you know when you married your spouse?" And I said, "Well, I didn't really have a frame of reference. I I didn't know what I didn't know." Um, and then she said something to the effect, "Well, I will always love you, and it doesn't make any difference to me," which was the most surprising thing I thought I would hear. Um, I didn't expect that, but I was really happy to get that. So then the next day, because I was at their house in Florida, she said at breakfast, after breakfast, "So, Beth, you've told me something that I haven't spoken about to your father. Why don't you tell him what you told me yesterday?" I was so sad and upset. I thought maybe I wouldn't have to do this, because I knew he was more conservative, and, it was harder to talk to him. And as I was telling him my story and, my coming out to him, he said, "Well, it's your life." And I thought, okay, yeah, it is my life. And I looked at him, I said, it's not a choice. This isn't something people would want to do. You don't get a lot of positive support when you come out. I said, it's not a choice. And my mother, who was in the next room, as I recall, slammed the cabinet door and said, "I told her it didn't matter, that we would always love her." And it sort of stopped him from saying anything. And we went on from there. So
Always good to have, mama bears around.
it was. And then years later, when I found and fell in love with my current wife, my partner at the time, my parents met her, and um, they fell in love with her. I mean, I think they always had an issue around women and men in being married to one another. Their concept of marriage is not as quite progressive, but I think they came to, they always loved her. And I think if they were born in a different time, they probably would find, the marriage to be a wonderful thing.
Hmm.
So,
So speaking of sort of like chronologically, did you meet your spouse first or attend VTS first?
so I met my spouse long before attending VTS. In fact, I had no concept of call um, until, oh, well, I would, yeah, probably uh, 3 or 4 years after we met. I mean, I was still involved in my Episcopal church in Houston, um, and met met her, and then said something a couple of years later about how much I would like to get back to the East Coast because that's where I grew up. And um, eventually, she got a transfer to the Washington D.C. office that she worked for, the company. And it was soon after moving to Washington D.C. Where I discerned a call that I ignored for 2 years because it was just too darn frightening that that might be possibly happening to me. And then I began the discernment process, which took another 2 or 3 years before attending or enrolling at VTS in 2006.
Mhm. So I would love to hear more about you and your spouse's story. So you were attending the Episcopal Church in Houston, um, and I assume that's maybe not in the church, but that's when you met your spouse.
Mhm.
Correct? Um, what was what was it like, you know, entering into this relationship, and eventually getting married in that particular Episcopal parish?
Um, so when we moved to Washington, D.C., we lived in DuPont Circle, and I walked to St. Thomas's in DuPont Circle. It was, 2 blocks away. Um, Marla, my wife, didn't go with me. She was my partner at the time. We weren't allowed to be married. She grew up in a Jewish household, and so attending church was not something that we did very often together. Although we did get involved both at St. Thomas's and the Jewish Community Center's congregation, Bet Mishpacha, and tended sort of together on high holy days and such. Um, People will tell you that Marla is the best thing about me, and I totally agree. She was also, completely supportive of everything that I have done and did at St. Thomas's and at the Episcopal Church at large. Um, but so let's see, you asked me about my church. Um, I was really involved in um, all aspects of St. Thomas's on the altar guild, um, was part of the vestry, was the treasurer, helped with spiritual formation, basically, a layperson, very, very involved, as I was in Houston. Um, and like I said, the discernment of the call sort of got put back in the cobwebs for a while until I was in transition from working in nonprofits and had talked to a friend about wishing that God would send me a sign because I really didn't know what I should be doing with my life. And I had been considering, because I had a background in healthcare, hospital chaplaincy. And a variety of things happened where, talking to an older member of the church, she said, because I said I was thinking about hospital chaplaincy, and she said, "Well, have you ever considered the discernment process?" And I said, "Tell me more. I'm not sure I know what that is." And so she did. And so then I started meeting with, at the time, Elizabeth Carl, who you might have heard about. She was our interim at St. Thomas's in DuPont Circle. And she and I began that spiritual process together. In the meantime, on the day that I said I wish God would send me a sign, I was at a finance committee that meeting that night, and the chair of the finance committee responded to me when I said I really need to get home. I've been spending a lot of time in the church office. Um, she said, "Well, when you become a priest, you'll be spending even more time in the church office." And I was dumbfounded. I had not ever mentioned anything about my discernment or my call. And I was like a scared little child. I ran all the way home. And if I could have pushed all the furniture up against the door to keep out whatever gremlins were following me, I would have. And a few days later, I saw this chairperson walking to work, and we talked. And I said, I've never mentioned this to you, but this is happening for me. And she said, I've seen things about people, and I've seen this about you for a long time. So I was just there were things that just kept coming to the surface with people affirming what they didn't even know I was struggling with or trying to figure out. So you asked about marriage. Marriage was not legal at the time that I went to seminary, but I was fortunate to be able to still live at home and to commute to VTS. So I commuted from DuPont Circle to Virginia. And I think I was finished with seminary in 2009. I graduated. And when marriage became legal, soon after that, people would ask us, are you going to get married? And Marla would always say, Beth hasn't asked me yet. So I figured out I better ask her. And one day, it was an anniversary of our commitment service. It was actually 10 years, the 10th anniversary of our commitment service. I got down on a knee and I said, you've made me the happiest person over these past 10 years. Will you marry me? And she said yes. And so because it was a major life change, I had to contact the bishop and say, Bishop, we've gotten engaged. I'd like to meet with you. So it was Bishop Chain of the Diocese of Washington at the time. And we went into his office a couple weeks later. And he and I and Marla were talking and said, well, what are you thinking of? And I said, well, Bishop, it's an interfaith marriage, so we're not going to be having a church wedding. And he said, well, that's okay. What are you thinking of? And so Marla said, well, we thought we might like to have a wedding outdoors in a gazebo, but we're not really sure if that's possible. And he said, you mean like in the bishop's garden at the cathedral? And we said, well, that would be great. But, he didn't really like outdoor weddings. And so she said something like that. And he said, well, why not? It has my name on it. And he turned his desk chair around to his computer and scheduled our wedding within minutes. And we left, and I knew we had a date and a time, but I wasn't exactly sure when it was. But a few weeks later, we had an outdoor service in the gazebo of the cathedral at 5:00. And it was just 6 of us, our 2 friends and Bishop and his wife and Marla and me. And it was just wonderful. It was a beautiful day.
Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
So let's turn our attention to VTS. By the time that you started attending VTS had already changed its policy to allow LGBT, though, to be honest, it was much more L in the G, to attend and earn an MDiv without it being any issue. Did you run into any sort of pushback with being a lesbian when you were applying and starting to come to VTS?
I didn't sense any. By the time I applied, I'm pretty sure that I had met Ruth Anna because she had visited St. Thomas's a couple of times. Ruth Anna Hook, who is a professor, and also a couple other faculty members had gone to VTS, and I knew who they were. So I didn't feel any pushback from my class or really from any of my professors. It seemed like, and there were some of my classmates who were also gay. So I wasn't the lone gay person in my class. So that was, we sort of had an automatic bond, I guess, if you will. I wasn't by myself in the community.
What was sort of the demographics? How many gay students do you think there were?
Let's see. In my class, there were at least 4. There might have been more. There were several more on campus, but I didn't know that until later. And our class, the class of 2009, was particularly diverse as far as age. We had some older students. Like I said, I entered when I was 48. Um, there were probably some students in their 60s, and there were students in their 30s, 50s, and some recently graduated college. So it was the whole spectrum from a lot of different places around the world.
With it being 2009, were you aware of any students that were having to remain in the closet due to their bishop's policies?
Not in the closet, but not practicing.
Hmm. Um, so you came in 2009, which would
6.
have been, or 2006, right?
It's okay.
2006. So you would have been here during the whole 2008 Lambeth with Gene Robinson. What was the atmosphere on campus during that whole situation?
Very, I think, engaged in how that was all gonna work. How was Lambeth gonna include or not include all the bishops from the United States or from the Episcopal Church? I think that may be part of the reason why we wanted to have a forum which we entitled Having a Conversation,
Mhm.
so that there could be some understanding, if you will, about not only coming out as people who are gay, but also relationships that people had with either a parent or a child who was gay. And then how could the church be affirming in and inclusive as congregations go? Um, we were very attuned. Professor Grebe was very involved with, the Anglican Consultative Council, and was traveling to, Canterbury quite often. And um, I think we all, were very curious about what the future of the church was going to be like, given, you know, the um, the threats of schism and the separation of some churches because of the inclusion of practicing homosexual bishops who were visible and out and not in the closet.
Um, what was what was the information being conveyed by uh, Dr. Grebe in particular, with her sort of knowledge of what's going on? By that I mean, you know, was she advising VTS in any particular actions, or what, or was
No,
she?
not at all. We just knew she was there, and she was one of the voices of um she was one of the voices that was trying to be heard, for what we believed was inclusion um and the the almighty power and love of God.
Mm,
Um, but I think it was more an awareness. She wasn't, I don't think, in any way really guiding VTS. I think we were more just in, you know inquisitive about her role and what role she was playing with some of these um, people that weren't as open and affirming.
mm. The who was sort of the motivator and organizer of the forum?
Well, I think probably Matt McDougall and I, as the students who were going to tell our stories, we talked a lot to, I believe, and this is a while ago, so I could, my memory isn't maybe as sharp or as clear, but I would say that we talked to Ruth Anna Hook, thinking that this might be something that would be helpful for the campus. And I believe Janet Zimmerman, who was a classmate of ours, was also as the chair of the forum committee, and I might have that title wrong, but she was also in our conversations, and was part of the forum itself.
How was the forum well attended?
It was well attended. We probably had 20 to 30 people. It was a 3-week forum, 3 consecutive, I think it was Thursday. Oh yeah, it says Thursdays on the flyer. 3 consecutive Thursdays. And there were professors there as well as students, and they were respectful conversations, with presentations to sort of kick off the topic. The first week was 2 students sharing their stories about coming out and the responses of their faith and their family, their friends, and their faith community. I was one of those students, and Matt McDougall was the other. So we talked for about 10 or 15 minutes each, and then opened the discussion for questions, and for conversation. Then the second week we had the family story, 2 people sharing about their relatives coming out, and the response of their family, their friends, and their faith community. And this was a son of someone who was gay and a mother of someone who was gay. And then finally on the third week we had the parish story, and Ruth Anna Hook invited her friend and colleague, Pastor Ginger Gaines Cirilli, who was pastor of the Capitol Hill United Methodist Church. And she spoke about how to become an open and affirming congregation. That session, all the sessions were well attended. And I think people came away with a better understanding of the challenges and the opportunities that we have to affirm one another.
Was there any pushback?
So yeah, there was. Unfortunately, someone took the flyer that we posted and sent it to a very conservative group at the time. I believe it was called Standing Firm in Faith. It was one of the breakaway groups. They had a blog, and they posted the flyer on the blog and said, "This is how VTS is handling, homosexuality," or whatever. And really, the comments were vitriolic about Virginia Seminary, about the dean. They really pushed back on the final line of the poster, which says, "The purpose of these forums is to provide an opportunity for dialogue and questions, not to debate homosexuality." We didn't feel like this was a time for conflict. We really just wanted to be sharing information for understanding. And anyway, so unfortunately, the blog was very damaging, and a lot of the students, I didn't actually hear about it until some of the students started to tell me about it, and several of the students posted comments in retort to the negative and vitriolic comments, which only furthered, more vitriolic comments and more hateful statements. It was very unfortunate and hurtful.
Did administration get involved at all with this sort of pushback, or did it all sort of remain at the student body level?
I don't recall that there was a statement that came out from administration at the time. I know that after the forum, and I don't know exactly how long after the forum, there was a sense on campus that the First Amendment needed to really be what we focused on. In fact, there was an effort or conversation, I'm not sure if it actually turned into an effort, but there was some conversation about, would we allow on campus someone from a conversion therapy organization, for instance, to come and to meet with the student body. And I know I pushed back on that, thinking that it was, we've come too far in our theology in and our positions as Episcopalians to bring someone who would be that damaging to a group of students onto campus, and to espouse a process that has not been founded and has in fact been proven to be damaging and is not supported by the psychological, so the American Psychological Association, other organizations. It didn't feel like the administration or the student government was hearing that. In fact, I know I at one point wrote again about my concerns that these kinds of organizations would do damage. Would we be so bold as to say that this was before all, anyway, so I said, would you allow the Ku Klux Klan to come on campus and to bring their vitriol and hate filled statements on campus? And the response, unfortunately, I thought was the same. It's a First Amendment right. And I was really discouraged that VTS would take this position, because I just didn't feel like that was appropriate, or really allowing for our common sense to be at the forefront. I don't think it ever happened. I wasn't aware of it, but it was a really difficult time.
You said that the students responded and retorted to some of these comments. Did you ever feel that there was pushback from within the student body?
To us, no, I didn't. I didn't find that to be the case. Of course, I wasn't living on campus, so I don't know if there was something happening at other hours of the day or the night that might have been happening, but I didn't sense anything. I felt like the students either just didn't have an opinion, or they were glad to see that this was taking place and hopeful. But I didn't feel from the students any, except for the one that apparently sent this off to the organization. I didn't feel any pushback, nothing directly to us, which unfortunately, if it would have it would have been better to have, I think, a conversation than to send a flyer out to some organization that was. And unfortunately, the bloggers quoted one of the students on campus about something else, and so we sort of connected the dots as to how the flyer got there.
And as far as faculty goes, faculty were supportive, neutral.
I think the faculty who were there, were supportive in that they were present, and I think they also were interested in learning. That they didn't seem to be there to oppose anything that was happening.
Do you remember which faculty attended?
I know that Dr. Jones was there, Dr. Rich Jones, and I think Dr. Grebe was there. I'm not sure of the other faculty who were there.
I will say, because I think Dr. Jones's opinions were well known to everyone. But I will say that I read one thing, so it sounds very much like something that he would attend, because he wrote in one, when they were like collecting information from faculty, when he was sort of writing his reasons for against changing the policies and things. He was the only professor to sort of give at least this much grace in his writing, in which he said something to the effect of, "I wait optimistically to be convinced." which didn't appear in the other professors who were against it. So it seems very much like him, that he would be willing to come and sit and
Yeah.
listen to learn. You know, so of course, Dr. Jones, Dr. Reed, Dr. Hook attended.
Yes, yes. She was kind of our faculty advisor. So
Okay.
yeah.
Did
So we
the-
had, I mean, there was a gay and lesbian student association. So we had a number of students who were part of the discussion to even offer this seminar. And then, because I found in my records when I was looking for the flyer that we had a list of the students, and we also had a list of sort of allies, people that were, willing to be part of the sort of the supportive network as there could be one at VTS.
was Dean Hook your faculty advisor for the group?
She must have been.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Had Bill Roberts come to VTS as the
He came
meeting?
my senior year or late in my middler year.
Okay.
Yeah,
Because I believe he was the second partner.
right. Yeah. Yes,
Um,
yes.
Okay. Of the faculty, of course, you've mentioned some, and of course, Dean Hook. Dean Hook sort of gets the,
She paved the way.
right. She
Dean Horn. Yeah.
she talked about so much about how when Bill Roberts came, she was so relieved to no longer be the. But of the faculty, who would you say were some of those allies?
Well, I my faculty advisors, I would say were definitely allies. Dr. Grebe was my, what do you call it? First year advisor. Dr. Judy Fentress Williams, and then both Dr. Lewis and Dr. Gortner. All of the advisors that I had were very supportive.
Mhm. Did you have any professors that were sort of like the obvious, sort of keep your distance from type of person, or did all of the professors, no matter their theological leaning, treat you or treat any gay or lesbian students with the same treatment?
I don't know that I mean, there were some that I warmed up to more than others. If there was somebody who had a definitely negative opinion, I didn't personally feel it.
Mhm.
I might not have felt as much that I could approach someone, but I did, it didn't affect my seminary experience. You could sort of tell who was a little bit more conservative, but was it because I was a woman? Was it because I was gay? Was it, because I was older? I don't, um,
Well, and the thing about Episcopalians is that we can hold Episcopalians hold cognitive dissonance really well,
mhm,
one professor that I know of, they've since retired, was not in favor of inclusion, but at the same time refused to be ordained themselves until women could be ordained.
right.
So there is that cognitive dissonance that is so easily found in Episcopalians. But
And I think I know who you're talking about, and I was very surprised and impressed when I learned that fact.
but there are but a lot of students that I've talked to that have said similar to what that if there were professors that you would have been able to say, would be opposed to inclusion, that didn't really affect how the professor treated them as a student.
Right.
That it was either, if you felt distance from that professor, it's just because that was that professor's personality and everyone felt distant from that professor. Or the professor would actually warm up to you as a student, and that might just be once again, the professor's personality of, distant to students when they first know them and then warm up to them before they graduate. So what you're saying is sort of consistent with a lot, particularly post 1980s
Right.
professors. That's not sort of the response of people who attended in the 70s, 60s, and 50s, where professors were really far more demonstrative in their opinions on students.
I will say that I had been following the conversations and the actions that were going on at VTS regarding the full faith. What was the
Call
terminology
to a holy
used?
living.
Call to holy living. So I knew before I even went into the discernment process that VTS had moved forward in a lot of ways. And so I wasn't at all concerned really about um, being accepted on campus. And I was shocked actually when our forum received such hateful responses.
Mm. You you said that there were out students or that were, just graduated college, and then some that were, this is a second career move. Did you find that there was a different reaction or a different expectation amongst those different generations of students
Regarding
how VTS should be responding to LGBTQ issues and inclusion? Like, for some, the thought process is that the story that a lot of people like to tell is that, those that had come through the 80s and the 90s, were much more patient in accepting slow incremental change versus those that were, sort of, born in the late 80s, early 90s, and were coming out of college. That they seem to be more demanding. Did you see that to be the case at VTS while you were here? That sort of divide of how to approach things?
I don't know. I think today there would probably be a more of a divide. I think all of us, because of what was happening with Lambeth, we were sort of on pins and needles about the church. There had been a huge shift, right before, well, and as we were all of us preparing to come to seminary. We also at the time had a new dean. So Dean Markham was, relatively new and getting his footing. And so some of the responses maybe that could have been different might be different today than they were then, as far as, the overall support of the seminary towards the students and some of the media attention that this forum got. But I think at the time it was probably a lot of caution because of what was happening in the larger church.
Did Dean Markham attend the forum?
I don't recall. Yeah.
What was it like, that transition from Dean Martha Horn, the dean who caused the change, to Dean Markham, who is now sort of tasked with leading this institution in this new era? What was it like being a student during that transition?
Well, I remember being excited that they had found a new dean and, really was looking forward to his leadership. I think he came in sort of midway through my years at VTS. And so, that was exciting. And he preached well, and he actually at the time wasn't ordained. So I think while I was there, he was ordained. I'm not sure of all the dates, but yeah, it was exciting to have this new beginning on campus with a new dean. Um, it was a process that took a while. I think actually when I started, might have been Dean Horn's last year, if not, um, she had already retired.
Mhm.
So it was exciting to have that new beginning. Um, Albeit, when you're a seminary and you don't have a lot of time to see all around you because you just have to kind of stay focused. But I had a little bit more, I guess, exposure because I was on the worship committee and I served as a sacristan. So I sort of had the behind the scenes, in the sacristy conversations with some people, and um, was really privileged to be able to meet the presiding bishop who came for um, the baccalaureate, mission of the church service, Catherine Jeffert Shorey, and actually remember hearing that I shouldn't be concerned that the pulpit was going to shake because this bishop named Bishop Curry was going to be coming to preach at VTS, and he gets a little animated, so we have to, don't worry, it's not going to fall off the wall. And so it was an exciting time for us at VTS to be able to experience a lot of really amazing leaders in the church.
When we have records that show that Dean Markham, when he first came, he whether or not we want to call it a policy or a disposition, an attitude of what he called generous orthodoxy, um, which was basically his way of saying we're moving forward. We're not going to change VTS's policy. We're not going to try to change the Episcopal Church's policy on ordinations and consecrations. But at the same time, we want to be generous to those who hold a conservative position. Is that how you experienced VTS while you were here? Trying to hold sort of both in tension?
I think so, yeah. VTS is not known as the high church seminary,
Mhm.
but there's certainly the breadth and width of the Episcopal Church represented there. Um, and it did feel that way when I was a seminarian, generous orthodoxy.
Did you think that while you were here, VTS was sort of shifting towards like a more big tent school, or still sort of remaining the low church, Virginia Broad, as they call it, type seminary?
From my own personal experience, I would say it was a more low church Virginia Broad. I understand that they moved more towards the big church, teaching us all about both high and low church and all the phases in between, or the expressions in between. Um, I would have appreciated learning more about higher church, um, just because as I said, I grew up Lutheran. We didn't do smells and bells. As a priest, not having that background, it it's not something I use very often. So I would learn. I would have been appreciative to learn a little bit more liturgically about high church. Um, so, but I can do that on my own, and I have. So
Do you think your identity and sexuality was reflected in any of the curriculum at VTS?
um, trying to remember some of the electives that I took that I think I was able to get a little bit more specific background or education. There wasn't, that I can recall, um, much in the way of liberation theology when I was there. I know that I took a Jan term on women in the Old Testament. That was a phenomenal course. And I don't know who taught, I can't remember who taught it, but learning about Deborah and Judith, and yeah, it was a great experience, great course. Yeah, it would yeah.
Mhm.
I hope that there's more expansive education and in the 15 years that I've been gone, or whatever, 14.
We do have liberation theology courses now, and feminist theologies. We have yet to add a queer theology. But because we're now affiliated with General, one of the professors that at General teaches courses in queer theology,
Good.
and students at VTS can take those courses online.
Great.
And also through the Washington Consortium, there are courses offered.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like for you finding a placement after VTS?
Sorry, I'm laughing because you just reminded me of when I was there before I did my field work. Jack Hadler was the professor who assigned to all of us 3 places we had to go visit as we were, doing the discernment of the interview process. And I'm laughing because he sent me to Pohick. And I didn't know what so for those of you who are listening to this, Pohick is a very old historic church in Virginia, Pohick, Virginia, with pew boxes and very conservative. And I walked into the church door, which I thought was the front door, to being inside the church, no narthex, no place to get your bearings, right in the middle of the aisle where pew boxes surrounded me. And this lovely gentleman came up to me and he said, "May I help you?" I said, "Yes, I'm here to attend worship." And he ushered me into a pew box, which I was petrified that I was sitting in someone's pew box, because all of these, thoughts that someone owned this box was, and I was impinging on their space, came flooding into me. It was most uncomfortable, I have to say. But it was an experience that I will never forget. That's an aside. As far as finding placement, I ended up doing my seminary work at Church of the Resurrection on Beauregard in Alexandria. And I was very aware that in the Diocese of Virginia at the time, I was not going to be able to serve as a priest when I was ordained. And so I didn't, I actually was there from the Diocese of Washington. So I was focusing on Washington opportunities and Maryland and, the areas around the DC area. But Virginia was not a possibility. And that really was sad, because I had grown to love the people that I was serving with and really enjoyed Virginia. So on my last Sunday, the text was from John's Gospel: "I am the vine, you are the branches. If you abide in me and I abide in you, you'll bear much fruit." And fortunately, I had also been taking a course on homiletics by the very Reverend Dr. Ruth Anna Hook, and she was teaching us to speak from our heart. And I told that congregation that they had tended me and we had grown together and we had, served the Lord together, and that I had been able to bear fruit, which they had witnessed, but that I was not able to serve as a priest in their diocese. And that I was leaving them with the charge that they needed to change that. And they did. They were one of the first congregations that participated in the diocesan conversations about full inclusion of gay and lesbian people who were partnered and out. And I'm so proud of that congregation and what they have done, both in the inclusiveness of the diocese, but also in the way they've created a wonderful church in the midst of low-income housing in Virginia. but I was hired soon after, well, before graduation, actually, as an associate assistant rector at Church of the Ascension here in Maryland, in Gaithersburg, and started on July 1st, soon after I graduated, and worked for them for 3 years, and then became, during my second year, in the search process for rector position, having had more than 20 years executive leadership positions in nonprofit organizations. So from there, I moved to Long Island and served a church for about 5 years, and then discerned a call to back into the Diocese of Washington at St. Nicholas Episcopal Church here in Germantown. And I've been here since 2017. Very happy.
I think I'd have to look, but I'm fairly certain St. Nicholas is where the priest who was banned from field placement supervision was at, the Reverend Jerry Anderson. He was an associate there. We'll double check.
Yeah, okay. I'm not sure. I don't remember hearing his name. The rector here was the founding rector before I came. And I'm not sure they had an associate, but that'd be interesting to find out.
I'll double check.
Yeah.
It sort of just rung in my head. I think that's Jerry Anderson.
You've heard it before. Yeah. I'll look it up too.
But I could be wrong, but I'll email you if
Okay.
So once you graduated, being a lesbian had no hindrance or factor into your being able to find a position as a priest. Is that correct?
As far as, well, I'm sure it had an effect for me not hearing back from some congregations. But I never know if it's, again, more female versus my sexual orientation. It's hard to say. Because there's no, reason why you're getting, why you're not hearing anything back. But I've been fortunate to land full-time employment and to be able to be fruitful in ministry. I will say that there were some people in probably all my congregations who were not on board with the idea of a female lesbian priest. I don't know if we have time, but I have a short story to tell. The Church of the Ascension was and is a very diverse congregation. At one point, it was considered the most diverse congregation in the Episcopal Church in Gaithersburg. I mean, in the Episcopal Church, and it is in Gaithersburg. And my first Eucharist, as my first Easter Eucharist, was at the Easter Vigil, the April or March after I was ordained a priest in January. And I had asked, since I had served there in July and I was being ordained in January, I was invited to ask some people to chalice at the cathedral for my ordination service. And I had asked a member of the congregation if she would be willing to be one of the chalicists. And she was from a country, maybe Nigeria. And she agreed, and I was thrilled that she said yes. And so she served at my ordination. And that was, like I said, in January. And a few months later was Easter, and I'm at the vigil and I'm celebrating the Eucharist and feeling just an amazing, that this was just an amazing experience. And the service is over, and it's midnight or whatever time it is. And the woman who had chaliced at the cathedral met me in the sacristy, and she said, "Do you have a minute?" I thought, no, I'm exhausted. I really need to go home. But I said, okay, yeah, what's going on? And she said, I need to tell you a story. So we walked back, and she said, we need to go back in the church. So we walked in the church, and she said, I was standing here and you were up at the altar, and this was before this, I guess it was that night. I'm getting my story confused. And she said, oh, I guess I was still a deacon. And she said, I was watching you watch the priest, and there was this aura, this thing that I saw around you. And she said, a voice said to me, who are you to question me? And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, I wasn't really sure about you being a priest, you know, with your sexual orientation and everything. And she said, I heard it again. Who are you to question me? And I just realized that God was talking to me and telling me I shouldn't be questioning anything. And I said, you've waited for 3 months to tell me this story? I said, this is the most wonderful Easter gift I could have ever gotten. I mean, it was powerful. I had no idea. I mean, maybe I did, but it wasn't, you know, didn't affect my being a pastor to her or being her priest. At that time, I wasn't a priest, but so yeah, so I guess, you know, they're like I had hoped with the seminar that we did, I'd hoped people would come to a better understanding that God calls who God calls, and we're all beloved children of God. It doesn't matter what our sexual orientation is, what our gender is, what our pronouns are, that we are all beloved children of God. And it was one of the most glorious things that I could have ever heard someone say to me, that God had said, who are you to question me? So I just try to live an authentic life and let people know they're beloved children of God, and that we won't have all the answers, and we don't need to have all the answers right now.
Is there anything else you would like to share with us?
I think that's a good high note to end on.
Thank you very much for sharing your story with us.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.